Basically, what reparations are is cleaning up the mess that white people created for black people. I mean, that's all it is. It's cleaning up the mess. And it's not just in this country. 15 Caribbean nations are suing 3 for the time being, England, France, and Holland, the Netherlands, for reparations. And they've got a 10-point plan to talk about this. So Africans throughout the world, in this country, African Canadians, African Mexicans, are all talking about reparations. It's not limited to this country. And there's tangible efforts to do that. Right now, a colleague of mine in the Virgin Islands is in negotiation with Denmark. Because as you know, Denmark colonized what we now call the Virgin Islands. So it's a global movement, and I've tried to study it. It's really interesting. When I first started writing about reparations about 20 years ago, all my colleagues were saying, "Ray, you're crazy, don't write about this. Nobody's ever going to come to hear you, or definitely not going to get a book written about it." So that has not been the case. And Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, I think it's the best article written by an African American since James Baldwin wrote back in the 60s. I mean, every sentence needs to be read. And the reason why is because he says, and I agree with him, that America really cannot be America without the payment of reparations. And it is something that we don't want to talk about. We avoid the discussion. And what I find the most difficult thing is that we don't know our own history. You heard about Sally Hemings, for example, right? What was interesting, we know that Thomas Jefferson systematically started raping her when she was about 14 years old. They were not in love, okay? I mean, she was being raped. So I remember a few years ago, one of these networks said, the greatest love story never told. Well, see, that's a fundamental distortion of history. What is interesting, though, is that taking Hemings and Jefferson as an example, the descendants of both of those families, right now, maybe about 10 years ago, they resisted, the Jefferson descendants resisted saying he really raped, even after DNA tests were done. So that resistance is still here, and that's what Ta-Nehisi Coates does in his article. Usually reparations activists like myself, we start at 1441, which is when the first Africans were extracted out of Africa, and go all the way up. What Coates does is the reverse. He starts now and goes back. So by the time you read his argument, which is formidable, you say, we gotta pay reparations. The problem with America is that Americans as a whole simply don't know their history. I mean, I'm very serious. I mean, this is probably the biggest indictment. We don't know our history because we've romanticized everything. I was in New England a few months ago, and it was an all-white group. And I started off by saying, how many of you know that Texas was taken from Mexico? And so one guy just stood up, he said, that's just not true. I mean, he was really, he said, haven't you read Dr. Winbush about the Alamo? And of course I did. I remember as a little kid growing up, Maggie in Warrensville Heights and Huff Avenue in Cleveland. She and I are from the same hometown. I remember crying when Davy Crockett was killed on Walt Disney. My brother and I, we just cried. When he was swinging the big rifle, and we were so sad because but see, we were being subtly brainwashed into the stuff. So this gentleman kept he said, I can't believe that. And then somebody got on the internet and said, well, that's true. And then, after just showing the data about this stuff, how that one of the reasons why Texas was taken from Mexico is because the South wanted to expand itself so that slavery would be legal in Texas. And the Mexicans didn't want that. They didn't want that at all. And so after reading this data and hearing it from somebody else, I was just standing up there listening to the people going back. The gentleman said, I don't care, I just don't believe it. And I think that attitude is the problem in America. We just don't know. Most people recommend, if you want to read a good history of the United States, Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, probably the best book ever written about enslavement. So what reparations are, what Coates talks about, I think this is the reason why his article is so widely read and there's such a discussion around the country about it on most major forms of media, is because he tells the truth about history, which many people simply don't know. They just don't know it. And I think that what we ought to do, if I were to tell what should people do about reparations, I would say start telling the truth about your history. And if you don't know your history, find what it is and then tell it the way it really is. They'll say, well, let's talk about the Alamo and Davy Crockett. Don't talk about slavery. Let's talk about Tom Jefferson, but let's not talk about Sally Hemings. So they don't tell you the part that you're not supposed to repeat. I want to read something real quick, and then maybe we can break into groups so we'll have a little bit more time. How many of you have heard of Toni Morrison? You haven't, I don't know what's wrong. This is one of her books. It's called What Moves at the Margin. And it's a collection of her nonfiction stuff. And in the article, and Toni will do this all the time, she, this is not long by any means, she indicts Frederick Douglass, Lydia Maria Child, and Olaudah Equiano. I don't know if you know him, he was kind of had a narrative. And the reason why she indicts them is because if you read 19th century slave narratives, and I don't like to use the word slave, or enslaved narratives, you start hearing this pullback when it comes to the real difficult part. Like there's very few enslaved narratives that talk about the rape of women. One thing that I had problems with this silly movie about a year ago called Django. Did you see this? There was never a scene of sexual assault in the film, and this was the most common form of rape that occurred in American history. I mean, the first absent fathers in this country were white males. They were. I mean, it was, but now it's like black males are but the first absent father, including Tom Jefferson, So what Toni says is that these writers like Frederick Douglass, they always talk about, well, let me read what Douglass says. He says, but let us now leave the rough usage of the field and turn our attention to the less repulsive slave life as it existed in the house of my childhood. I am not about to herald the feelings of my readers by a terrific representation of the untold horrors of that fearful system of oppression. It is not my purpose to descend deeply into the dark and noisome caverns of the hell of slavery. So then, now Toni is talking. She says, over and over, the writers pull the narrative up short with a phrase such as, quote, but let us drop a veil over these proceedings too terrible to relate, in shaping the experience to make it palatable to those who were in a position to alleviate it. And they were silent about many things, and they forgot, in quotation mark, many other things. In other words, these writers like Douglass, and I know you're not supposed to criticize Fred Douglass in Baltimore especially, but her critique of Douglass is that they stopped short of telling about the horrors. So then she says this, and this is where I'll end this on. She says, for me, this is Toni speaking, a writer in the last quarter of the 20th century, not much more than 100 years after emancipation, a writer who is black and a woman, the exercise is very different. And then she says, my job becomes how to rip that veil drawn over, quote, proceedings too terrible to relate. The exercise is also critical for any person who is black or who belongs to any marginalized category, for historically, we were seldom invited to participate in the discourse, even when we were its topic. So what Tony argues is that we have to rip apart the veil that Fred Douglass tried to drop on those terrible things. And I think that's what reparations does. It says, look, we're going to tell history the way it is. And after we tell it the way it is, and you understand the way it is, let's do something about it. Let's start repairing some of the damage. Not that you can ever repay what occurred in this country. Just imagine if all of you, as I said in the group, what if all of you worked for me for free? I didn't have to pay you anything. Maggie, I send you to buy the groceries. Dottie, I go over and tell you to paint the house. I take a half dozen of you to pick cotton. Then I would make all the money. Then I would breed some of the women in here with some of the men and then sell their children. And I ain't working for nothing. And I did this for free. And I only did it for a dozen years, but I did it for hundreds of years. And then after emancipation, there was another 100 years of American apartheid. So I think that we, as reparations activists, hopefully, that you have to pull the veil back like Tony recommends. You have to tell the truth. And it's difficult in America to tell the truth. So difficult. So I'll stop there.